All right, good morning. Good morning. Welcome to Adult Education, the Good, the Bad, and the Uncanny, exploring the Older Testament. Welcome to those joining on the live stream and those of us who are here together in the room. We've got some announcements this morning. As always, you are welcome to discuss the material further with me and Matt on Wednesday evenings from 6:45 to 8 p.m. If you're here, it's in the Meisel room. If you are joining us online, there's a Zoom link in the Adult Ed e-blast. So that's where you find the Zoom link. Please feel free to join us in person or online. We get to kind of continue the conversation that starts on Sunday mornings here. There are other supplemental resources available. There's a great interview with Anna Marsh on Leviticus, 30 minutes on Leviticus. You're going to be riveted. She actually does a really, really great job with the material and really helped me in my preparations for today. So please check out that interview. And one thing that happened on Wednesday night is that folks asked, hey, how do we get to the materials? Can you give a little refresher on how to get to those online videos? So that's what I'm going to do now. Let's see. Let me end this for now. So let's say here I am at the Westminster website and I'm looking for the adult education resources page for this class. So I come over here to Grow, Adult Education, that's us. And then there's a couple of ways of accessing the page from the site. So you can scroll over here. This is the tricky way, where it says the good, the bad, and the uncanny. You see your cursor becomes a little pointer. That's a link to click. Or we've got this big orange button over here. That's our resources page. Just click on that. And here we go. You'll see we've got our reading guide posted here. Our timeline is posted here. Maps are here. And then when you scroll down, here's the Anna Marsh video on Leviticus. Scroll down further. If you missed it, Exodus, you can get our Exodus video or the recording of this class. So that's how you find and access the materials online. If you're having any problems, just email me or Matt, and we can help you get sorted. But I really do recommend those videos. All right, so let's get back to our announcements page. One further announcement, this comes from our friends at Grace Trinity Church in Uptown. They are having an event on Monday night called Bible Stories for Grown-Ups. A pastor named Josh Scott has written a book by that title. He'll be there at 7 p.m. The event is co-sponsored by Magers and Quinn booksellers. So if you're free on Monday night and want to do a little more exploring, one of our partner churches is engaging in that event. So as we get started, it looks like we're kind of settled in the room. I did want to name something for us today. I don't know how you all have been feeling this week, but the events of this week have been really close on my heart, and I know that you guys have been thinking about this too. When I was in college, I went to the 7th floor of the Yale Library to the map room, and I got a map of what was called the Holy Land. It was from maybe the 17th century. It was a bunch of little cartoon drawings of the Bible stories located in the land, and I got them to photocopy it. I put it up on my wall, and one of my teammates, my friend Deco, actually came and visited me in my dorm room, and said, he pointed to the map on the wall, and he said, "Would you ever be interested in going there?" And I thought, really, go there? Because to me, it seemed like Middle Earth, some sort of fantasy place from Lord of the Rings, not a real place, but it is a real place with real people living in it. And as we continue our exploration of the Older Testament, I want us to just pause and acknowledge in a prayer what is happening there, because I know it's on everybody's hearts and minds. So let us pray. Holy One, we lift before you the conflicts in our world, especially this day, the war between Israel and Hamas. We pray for the people of Gaza and the people of Israel. We pray for those who are mourning and those who are missing, and those who are fleeing their homes, and those who are hungry, thirsty, injured, afraid, those who have experienced and are experiencing trauma, those who live under the threat of violence, those experiencing humanitarian crisis, and for those providing aid. We pray, O Lord, for an end to divisions, for a way forward, for justice, and for peace. Amen. These themes will return to us. We are, this exercise is not entirely an academic one. Our look today will be at the law. Next week we'll be looking at land. These are themes that run throughout the texts as well as today. But for our purposes in this class, we really will be examining the law kind of as we see it and experience it in the Older Testament itself. And we've got a lot of ground to cover today to do this. We'll be starting in Exodus. I'm reaching back into Matt's text from last week because we get a lot of the law starts there in Exodus at Sinai. We'll go through the priestly law and the holiness code in Leviticus. I see we've got the Reverend Dr. Tim Hart Anderson in the back. Tim, what book are you preaching on today? You can't remember? Leviticus, right? We're actually going to hear a sermon that references Leviticus. So this is very timely. Thank you, Tim. Appreciate it. Next, we'll get to Numbers, which is wilderness wandering, and then we'll end with Deuteronomy, which means second law. So we've got a lot of ground to cover today. A reminder about our time frame. We are talking about the period after the escape from Egypt during the wilderness wandering when the law is received at Sinai. This will take us right up to the entrance of the land of promise. This is the time that the stories are set. It's not the time that the stories are written. If you have the timeline with you, or if you've got a copy of it, you can access it online. We've got some copies in the back. You'll see that we differentiate between when in the chronology of the biblical story are these books set, and when in the chronology of the history of this region are the books probably, we think, written. And most of them, we think, are written of sources that come from various periods that are then redacted, so this happens over a long period of time. But a lot of the context of the writing of these stories is exile or post-exile. These are stories written in the context of displacement. So that's an important part of, as we think through what we find here, that's part of the context that we're seeing. The community is kind of having a present experience of exile at the time that we're hearing these stories of wilderness wandering. And we're going to encounter in this part some stories of wilderness wandering, but a lot of law. And I am very encouraged to see how packed this room is for discussion of biblical law. This is not notoriously one of the most fun parts, but I do want us to start by having a little bit of table conversation, or if you're in the back, just sort of form a little group around this question. What have you been taught about the role of the law in the Christian tradition? So what messages have you received about what the biblical law is doing and how we encounter it in our life of faith as a church? What are some of the messages that you've gotten either as a child or recently? How do you understand the law? So I'll give you a couple minutes to talk at your tables, and then we'll get Rocky up and passing the mic. If you're online, you're welcome to write in the chat. Okay, so I'm going to bring us back and ask for any reports. So what were some of the messages that you learned about the law? What are your... Yeah, I see Sheila over here.
I was raised with a don't attitude. Don't do this, don't do that, don't do that. And I was also an optimist from the get-go. So it was always difficult for me to reconcile that. And when I was about 30, I ended up sitting down with the Ten Commandments. And instead of, I wrote them as positives instead of the negative. And I had a friend who's a Jewish person who writes marriage contracts in beautiful form. I don't know what it's called, and she rewrote that, and we have it on our wall always. But unbeknownst to me, she overarched what she wrote in calligraphy with love your neighbor as yourself, because she saw it, even though I didn't say that as a Jew, that's really what it was affirming. It was lovely.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. So law as constraint versus law as gift or freedom. Yeah, I see up at the front table.
This table talked about the Ten Commandments, that most of our thought of the law is rather negative, that the Pharisees, and it's kind of something the Jewish people should worry about. For Christians, they're just kind of misdemeanors.
Okay, so this idea, right, that that law was binding for Jews, optional for Christians. That's been a very strong message of the church, and we're gonna explore and explode that a little bit today. That's one of the goals. But yeah, no, thank you for that message. Yeah, other thoughts? I see John.
We were talking about the golden rule.
A little closer to your mouth.
We were talking about the golden rule. And I'm wondering, my idea, just hearing it just now, I hadn't thought about it, if people would follow the golden rule, we wouldn't really need the Ten Commandments.
Sure.
And we really wouldn't need the law.
Do we need the law if everybody's doing unto others as they... Yeah. So that's a good question. And it's interesting, even the New Testament has different things to say about law. You know, there are places where it seems like, you know, there's a real strong contrast between law and gospel, but then we have Jesus saying, I have come not to abolish the law and the prophets, not to abolish, but to fulfill, right? So even within the Christian tradition, there's ambiguity and difference about what the role of the law is. Yeah, any other, one or two other thoughts on this? I wanted to touch briefly on the law through the lens of Christian reformers. So these guys, Luther and Calvin, right, have had a major influence on the way that modern day Protestants think about the law. So for Luther, and this is really painting with a broad brush because, okay, I see we've got another comment there. Is it about messages around the law? If you could hold on for 1 second, Rocky's gonna get you the mic. Yeah.
I apologize, everybody. This is just kind of a random question because I think of Luther and Calvin instructing, Calvinism and Lutheranism. But how about the Anglicans? Are they?
Oh boy. Now we're reaching beyond my area of knowledge. I don't know what the Anglicans thought about the law. I think when I think about the major theological contributions, the sort of twin poles that I'm aware of are Luther and Calvin. I think that's where a lot of the sort of major theological work was being done. But I don't know the Episcopal or Anglican tradition as well, so I'm not sure where they were on this. But in terms of thinking about what's our general Christian conception of the law, I mean, these guys are kind of the major players around it. And Luther thought that the law had an important civil use, right? We don't want to live in a lawless society. Law restrains sin. But then it also has this spiritual use of revealing sin, right? In Luther's view, one of the contributions that the law makes to us is that it reveals our guilt, fills the conscience with terror, and drives men to despair, right? Sort of the law makes the grace feel all the more powerful. Again, broad brush here. We could spend an entire season on Luther and the law. Calvin, kind of two similar uses and a third. So that same kind of teaching use of showing us our condemnation, a political use of creating a good society and restraining human wickedness. But then there's also, Calvin introduces this third use of the law, this sort of normative use, that law can be helpful in guiding a Christian in how to lead one's life. Not a condition of salvation, but a response. And so Calvin had a little bit more of a positive take on things than Luther did. Again, broad brush. Just to say, let's remember as Christians reading this now, what we're reading this through, right? That we're reading this through hundreds of years of history that's taught us and shaped how we think about the law. And so what I want us to do now is turn to Scripture and to look at the logic of the law as it unfolds within Scripture itself. This is different from saying, let's take a look at how Jews view the law, because Jews, too, have had just incredible developments over time. We can't say, 10 Commandments on Sinai, the giving of the law, that's frozen. All Jews have followed the law just like it's stated in the Bible ever since, right? That's to deny centuries of developments in Judaism. And in fact, a large part of rabbinic Judaism has to do with this ongoing conversation around interpretation of the law. So I'm not saying we're taking a look at the law through a Jewish lens. We're going to take a look at it sort of what is the logic and the structure within the Scriptures themselves. So we're going to start with Exodus. And for each of these books, I'm going to do a what and a so what. Okay, and this comes from a question that Joey raised on Wednesday night, which is not just what's in these books, but why does it matter? So for each of these books, I'm going to try to tease out both of those elements. So what do we find in Exodus? The 10 Commandments, as we've already mentioned. These are written in the second person, thou shalt not, right? These are addressed from God to the people. They're absolute. And they are not given with any kind of penalty attached or any other kind of enforcement mechanism, right? This is not the place, it's not thou shalt not murder or thou shalt be murdered. We'll get to that later, but the 10 Commandments themselves are really this sort of statement of values that we find at the beginning. So then we get what's called the covenant collection, which is a set of kind of case law that really begins to interrogate some of these values that we find in the 10 Commandments. So what happens when your ox gores your neighbor's servant, right? What happens in these various cases? What if somebody is pregnant and gets and is hit by somebody having a fight? You know, how do we adjudicate these particular cases? And here we do start to see both of them written in the third person and some penalties that are attached. So some of these are about criminal law, some of these are about property crimes, some of these are about the social order, care for widows and orphans and the poor, and some of them are about the ritual calendar, how to celebrate the Passover. All of these get kind of woven together, and we're going to see this again and again. This is not an organized code of law, right? This is not something that like Rocky's going to have on his bookshelf in his office that separates the law into different categories. It's not a sort of a clean sort of summation or restatement. This is much more disorganized. Although the lawyers in the room will also know that in the United States, in a common law system, there is a lot of disorder and chaos, especially if you're looking at case law. Right? A lot of things do get kind of mixed together. So, but don't come into this expecting a sort of clean and organized code. So after we get the 10 Commandments and then the beginning of some fleshing out of what those 10 Commandments mean, we stop for a little narrative. There's a ratification ceremony. The people agree to obey the law. There's a sacrifice with some blood, and this is where the covenant gets ratified. Then we go back, Moses goes back up the mountain, the rest of the people stay at the foot of the mountain, and gets some instructions about how to build the tent, the tabernacle, right? And again, this is going to feel random. This is maybe not how we would have written a narrative story in a sensible way, but I'm going to argue that there's a real logic to how this happens, how this all unfolds here. So when Moses gets instructions from the Lord for how to build the tabernacle and for the priests who are going to be in the tabernacle serving God, get some instructions about that too. And then we have another narrative story, right? The golden calf. So instead of building the tabernacle as instructed by God, the people are getting impatient. Moses has been up there now 40 days and 40 nights. Where is he? Has he forgotten? We just ratified this covenant and now our leader's gone and God's gone. Where is everybody? So they ask Aaron to make them this golden calf. Aaron does so. God gets really angry, right? There's a difference between what God has instructed them to make and what they've actually made. Moses intercedes at this point to save the people from total destruction, and that works. We're going to see another theme here of Moses and God working out this relationship, negotiating how this is going to go, even as the laws are being given. So at the same time as the laws are being given, they're also being broken, and there also is this negotiation of what then are the consequences. How do we continue to live together? That theme is going to come up again and again, that pattern throughout these books. So then after the golden calf incident, what we have is the tabernacle construction. So all of the instructions that were given before the golden calf are then carried out. The Israelites bring their precious goods. They make an offering, basically. This is actually a good stewardship text because they make an offering of what they have, and their fabric, their gold goes into the construction of this tabernacle, which is to be the house of God that follows them in the wilderness. One of my favorite things about the tabernacle instructions when you read them is that everything has rings attached to it. Not just the curtains on the curtain rods, but the table, the ark, all the furniture, the lampstands, everything has a ring attached to it. And that's so that it can be slung onto poles and carried with the people, right? The tabernacle is meant to be a mobile place for God to dwell with the people. And that's written right into the instructions. So there is in these details of these texts, they're really important aspects that kind of show you why this matters. And then at the end of the story, at the end of the book of Exodus, God's glory enters the tabernacle. So it's worked, right? They've built this place that God is able to kind of dwell with them in the wilderness. So what's the so what of Exodus, right? That's the what, that's the arc of the story. Why does this matter? So the first thing to say about the law as we get it here in Exodus is that this is not your average ancient Near Eastern covenant. We have examples of others, things written in Sumerian, Akkadian, other ancient languages, and most of those are written by the king, by the ruler, to the people. So here the difference is that this is written by God, right? That God is the one who authors, maybe not writing down, God is delivering these commandments, right? It comes from God, not from Moses. And so it's prior to the political system of kingship. When the kings arise, they will be bound by this law just like everybody else. It doesn't depend on the ruler to give or authorize the law. And it also happens prior to the arrival in the land. The law is given in the wilderness, right? The land is also part of the promise, but these two are not connected in that the law can still apply even outside the land. It involves the consent of the governed, right? Nobody agrees to these other Near Eastern covenants between the ruler and the people. In this one, Israel says, all that the Lord has said we will do, we will obey, right? They give affirmative consent to this law, which is just revolutionary. And other things about these ancient and it applies to all the people, not just the priestly caste. This is also not a covenant between two equal rulers of peoples. This is a covenant between God and all the people. And there's some other interesting features of this that differentiate it from other covenants. So on Friday night, I was at a bar, I was having a bourbon, and I was reading a book about the Talmud. I obviously need to find more friends in Minnesota, but that's what I was doing on Friday night. And there is this guy sitting next to me, and he says, what are you reading? And then he saw, and I said, oh, and he's like, well, have you heard of the Code of Hammurabi? And I was like, well, yes, I have heard of the Code of Hammurabi. And he said, yeah, it's really remarkable when you read that, because they had different punishments for different classes of people. And I was like, yes, that's correct. The Code of Hammurabi, which is one of these other ancient Near Eastern codes, is probably one of the most well-known and well-studied one, distinguishes punishments based on the social status of the person that you've injured. There's a different level of punishment if you've injured a higher class person or a lower class person or a slave. So it values different lives differently. The law in the Bible doesn't do that, right? Murder is a capital offense kind of no matter what, unless it's accidental. There is a distinction between murder and what we would call manslaughter. So in some ways, the harshness of the law, it can be thought of when it's put in its context as this sort of egalitarian feature, this valuing of all life equally. So anyway, I thought it was really interesting that somebody sitting in a bar gave me part of my lecture for today. It was not what I'd anticipated. He was also very surprised to learn that I'm a pastor. I could do an entire sermon series on conversations about religion I've had with people who don't realize I'm a pastor. So let's see. So that's another sort of distinction, right, between this set of laws and ancient Near Eastern laws. I don't want to tell you that when you open the laws and read them for yourself, I don't want to set up this expectation that you're going to find this incredibly progressive masterwork that's just going to read like something you'd want to sign up for, you know. There's also in this same section, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, right? There are things that are really hard to hear and find and encounter. So I'm not saying that, you know, we're going to find in here something that we can all be on board with. But when you do compare it to other law codes of the time, it shows this remarkable kind of difference. And it's basically a story about how to live with each other and with God. These laws are all mixed together, the ones that have to do with ritual and the ones that have to do with how we treat each other. They're all of a piece. And they all arise from what God announces to the people right before delivering the law, which is, if you obey my voice and keep my commandment, you shall be a treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. And again, this emphasis that it's not just for one class of people, the priests, that this law really applies to how everybody relates to one another and how everybody relates to God. It really is this sort of, God is really kind of constructing a people here. So let's move on. There's one other thing that I wanted to show you about Exodus before we leave, because it basically takes the narrative structure from the beginning, from the creation to the tabernacle construction, and there's this beautiful correspondence. So this comes from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who's got a great book called Covenant and Conversation, and he goes through the whole structure of the first two books. So it begins with the creation of the universe. Then we have humanity and its failings, right? The fall, the Nephilim, Cain and Abel. Disaster sent by God, a flood. Hubris, the Tower of Babel constructed to touch the sky. The family of the covenant, right? The patriarchs, the matriarchs, their families. The people of the covenant, right? We end Genesis in Egypt. We start Exodus in Egypt with the story of this family who's become this sort of disorganized people. The hubris of Pharaoh, the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. Disaster, right? The plagues. God sends the plagues. The people and their failings. People are led out of Egypt. There's a lot of complaining in the wilderness, right? We don't become a pious, grateful people, right? We stay human in this whole picture. And then the creation of the sanctuary. The creation of the tabernacle kind of completes this sort of chiastic structure that begins with the creation of the universe. And we can even see, if we look at some of the words that are used here, the same words are used. God saw all that God had made, and behold, it was good. God finished the work and blessed it. The same words are said of Moses at the time of the construction of the tabernacle. So this is not some sort of incidental sideshow. This is central to the structure of the story as a whole, and really makes the tabernacle this site of interaction with the Creator God. So the story ends with the cloud covering the tent of meeting. The glory of God fills the tabernacle. Moses not able to enter the tent of meeting at this point. This is an important detail. God's glory is in the tabernacle. Moses can't go in. And then when the cloud is taken up from the tabernacle, that's the sign that it's time to decamp and go, and everybody marches out, and they put the poles in the rings of all the tabernacle furniture and bring it with them. But when the cloud rests, they stay. So that's how they're going to move through the wilderness. So what this really sets up is this question of how are the people going to travel with God? How will they live with God in the wilderness? Okay, this is going to be an aside. This is my dog, the Winnie. She is obviously the cutest dog in the world. What kind of dog is Winnie? Beagle. Winnie is a beagle, yeah. Which means that she's really into sniffing and barking and being a scamp and getting into everything, right? And so I love Winnie, but I also love camping, right? I love exploring the fall leaves. I was trying to think, can I take my dog camping, right? Can I figure out how to spend the night in a tent with my dog? The answer is I don't know, right? Because she is all beagle, it's who she is. She is gonna bark and sniff. If I let her off the leash, she's gonna run after whatever she smells in the woods. It would be a hard thing to do, to go camping with a beagle. If you know how to do this, tell me after class. And the reason that I thought of it, the reason that I'm showing you this is because I think there's an analogy here to the ways that Israel is traveling with God, right? There is this all-powerful, all-holy God who is coming along with them on this trip in the universe, and you have to be really thoughtful about how that's going to go, You can't just lock God in the car while you pitch the tent, right? It's a different scenario, but one also that it involves some real sort of thoughtfulness about how do we do this? How do we make this trip together? So let's turn back to Leviticus. You needed to see something cute before we got into Leviticus. That was... So for each of these books, we're going to see continuity with what comes before. It's going to feel like randomness. There's going to be a lot of laws. It's going to feel boring. But when you look at the details, there really is some continuity that exists among these books here. So in Leviticus, the title in sort of Greek, Hebrew, Leviticus Greek and Latin, Leviticus, that has to do with the Levites, this class of people who were assisting the priests. But there's a Hebrew title, which is Vayikra. The Hebrew titles of the books are named after the first words or some of the first words of each book. And that word means, and he called out, and God called out. So it starts with the word and, right? You're not supposed to start a sentence with and, but here we have a whole book starting with and God called out. So it's a continuation of what came before. The Lord God called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. So not in the tent of meeting. Moses isn't in the tent yet, right? Can't be in the tent with God, but God is still calling out and giving instructions. So what are these instructions? We got sacrifices, a lot of different kinds of sacrifices. Ordination of priests. How do we get the priests ordained so that they can serve God in the tabernacle? There's some danger that happens. This is where we have a disruption between the law and the narrative, and we have a story of two of Aaron's sons going into the tent improperly, using what's called unauthorized fire, and getting burned up by the holiness of the Lord. Right, so it is dangerous there is God who is good is also holy, powerful. This is the source of all life. This is not something to be taken lightly. And two of Aaron's sons get burned up in this unauthorized fire. Then there's a number of laws about purity. Right, we're going to get some food laws. We're going to get laws about what you can and can't touch. Some of this is going to help you to be, if you're impure, you don't want to get anywhere near that holiness, that holy center. So these purity laws are meant to help kind of manage the people who are interacting with this holiest of holy stuff. The middle of Leviticus, we get Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, right? A way of when things go wrong, of reconciling the people to God. And notice, this is chapter 16 of Leviticus, which is the center of the Torah. We tend to dismiss Leviticus, but it is given place of pride in the Torah as a whole, those first 5 books. And Yom Kippur is really the center of this. How do we relate to God? How do we atone? How do we stay in relationship to God? This is followed up by what's called the Holiness Code. Tim is going to be preaching out of the Holiness Code today. We'll hear from him in Leviticus. And the Holiness Code may be a slightly different source from the rest of Leviticus. And I'm not able to use my mouse here. I'm going to just escape for 1 second and then come back in. Okay. So the Holiness Code, right? This is a part of the law that has to do with not just the priests and the sanctification of the priests, but the people as a whole. How do people treat each other as a whole? And this part also relates kind of moral and ethical behavior as well. And this again comes to that initial speak to the congregation of Israel and say, you shall be holy, the whole congregation, not just the priests. So here are some familiar lines from the Holiness Code, right? You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Where do we hear that in the New Testament? Jesus says that, yeah. In which parable in particular? The lawyer, yes, the lawyer parable, the Good Samaritan, right? The lawyer asks Jesus, what is the most important commandment? Jesus says, what do you say? And the lawyer names this one, pulls this one out of Leviticus. This is where it comes from. And then we have another law, part of this Holiness Code. When an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides among you shall be to you as a citizen among you. And you shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So this is not just about how the people treat each other, it's about how they treat foreigners who reside in their midst. And it comes out of 2 sources. One is just the holiness of God. I am the Lord your God. That is the authorizing force behind all of these laws. And then some of them also have a kind of justification given where God gives an additional reason for this. And here it's located in that narrative story. It's back in that Exodus account. You were aliens in Egypt, remember. So memory is a big part of law, and story gets bound up in law. Let's talk about this holiness phenomenon in general, right? We've already said it's anchored in who God is, the character of God. And it means this sort of unique and powerful source of life. We've already connected this God to the God of creation, right? God is the source of life. And so that means that God is also in some ways intense and dangerous, kind of like the sun. You don't want to get too close because there is this source of life is very, very powerful. And just God is intrinsically holy. Things and people can be sanctified, can be sort of rendered holy enough to be in the presence of God, but that takes a process, and that process is what we've got a lot of these laws in place for. And there's a distinction here, I've got it on the board too, between holy and common. So God is holy. Most everything else is common, right? It doesn't mean bad. Sometimes we translate that word as profane, but it doesn't mean bad. So God is holy. Most everything else is common. And then there's another separate distinction between pure and impure, right? Some things are pure and some things are impure. Also not a moral distinction, right? It's a ritual distinction. And impurity generally has to do with having touched something having to do with either death or sex. Not in a sort of morality way with the sex, right? It's just God is immortal, doesn't die, doesn't have sex. Some of the other Canaanite deities did, right? But the God in the Hebrew Bible, not thought to have a consort, although there are some. Anyway, I'm not going to go into that. This is to say, generally, impurity has to do with things having to do with sex or death. So corpses, if you touch a corpse, that renders you impure. Not necessarily bad, maybe you're burying a family member, right? But don't go into the Holy of Holies because you're impure right now. You've touched death. You need to be restored to a state of purity so that you can enter that sanctuary. Skin diseases. There's something translated as leprosy, not the same as modern leprosy, but a skin disease. Discharges, especially genital discharges. These render someone impure, again, because they're about sex, they're about sexual reproduction. not because they're about sexual morality. Mold in your house, right? Same category, also impure. So impurity is contagious. If you touch an impure thing and then somebody else touches you, that your impurity can spread. But it's also impermanent, right? It can be restored. That's what a lot of these rituals provide, a period of separation or a ritual of washing, something like that, to help this impurity not be so permanent, to restore a person to the community. A lot of what feels to us like really draconian strictures are actually about bringing people back in. Anna Marsh's interview on this is just incredible. And not all of it is sinful, right? A lot of impurity is not about sin. It's about just natural things that happen. Some impurity is sinful, right? If you murder somebody, you should not be going into the Holy of Holies. So the Bible draws this distinction. We don't want to say that these things are severable. We don't want to say, we'll just obey the moral laws and not the ritual laws. That's importing a later Christian lens onto the law. But the law itself does make a distinction between things that you should be held responsible for and be guilty for, usually, again, matters of death and sex, right? Murder, adultery, and it's different from things that happen like touching a corpse. And moral impurity is not considered contagious, and it's removed by either punishment or atonement, depending on whether there was intentionality behind it, rather than by a ritual of washing. So we do see a tension here to sort of what we would consider moral and ethical kinds of behaviors. So what's the so what of Leviticus? We've covered a bunch of this already, and I'm gonna zip through because we got to get to Numbers and Deuteronomy in the next 13 minutes. So I think we've covered almost all of this, except for this one. What is this about? This is about making space for God so that God can dwell with the people, right? God has made space for the universe. God, who is infinite and all-powerful, has made space for creation and for freedom. And this is a sort of corresponding human act of making space for God, making room for God, who is so different, to dwell and live in the midst of humanity. That's what this is all about. Jonathan Sacks says the Sabbath is about making time for God by refraining from the acts of creation, from doing any of that work that really belongs to God to do. And in some way, the sanctuary that's described in the Torah is about making space for God, preserving this space that is holy, that can be a place that God can dwell among the people. Not as a statue, not an idol, not an object. The Bible is pretty insistent on that, but as a presence with the people. Okay, so Numbers. I'm going to fly through Numbers, which is unfortunate because there's some really great stories in Numbers. The Hebrew title, Bamidbar, in the wilderness, right? So we are still in the wilderness. Haven't actually moved yet from Sinai. So the people stay at Sinai for about a year, receiving all of these laws. Numbers is where the movement does begin to happen. The Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting, right? From the tent of meeting before, but now in the tent of meeting. These rituals, these priestly laws, have enabled Moses to go into the tent of meeting. Something has shifted and changed since Leviticus began, right? This technology of ritual is working, is opening space for this encounter to take place. So that's a shift between Leviticus and Numbers. And God tells Moses to take a census of the whole congregation of Israel. So Numbers, in the Latin title, refers to that census. So it's the numbers taking, the counting of the people of Israel, and you'll see them organized by tribe. You'll see the camp laid out spatially in a very orderly way, right? This is still that priestly source. And this is the first of two censuses in the book of Numbers, which is important. So it begins with a census. Then, in about chapter 10, the command comes to depart. So the presence of the Lord lifts up from the tabernacle. That's the sign. It's time to go and follow the presence of the Lord, this sort of cloud through the wilderness. So the people march out in order. They gather up the tent. A lot of attention is paid to who's carrying the parts of the tabernacle, who's commissioned for that work. And so, because it's, again, this mediation of the presence of God among the people. We get more complaints. God is less patient with the people's complaints now than God was in Exodus. There's a lot more, the punishments get harsher. God seems to be expecting the people to be sort of holding up their end of the bargain on this covenant. So we get some difficult stories here. Miriam becomes leprous in one of them. A bunch of people get plagues. I mean, this is a fraught relationship, right, between God and the people. And probably the low point comes when some spies are sent to look at the land of promise and see what's there, and they find this land, of abundance flowing with milk and honey. But some of the spies are fearful because the land seems full of strong peoples, and so they want to give a more negative report back to the people. And the Lord gets really angry about this, so angry as to say to Moses, "I'm going to wipe out this whole generation, and I'm going to start over with you, right? Forget all these people and their descendants. We're going to start with you and create a whole new people, right?" It's kind of hearkening back to a flood-style response from God, a wipe out and begin again. And Moses again intercedes and says, and begs God not to do that. Kind of says, think about your reputation, right? You brought us out of Egypt, and you're going to kill us all in the wilderness. That's a constant Moses refrain. So what ends up happening is that that God says, okay, fine, but the generation that knew Egypt will die here in the wilderness. Those people will die, their descendants will continue, but the people who started in Egypt won't see the promised land, which is why we've got this 40 years of wandering happening. Moses and Aaron, they're also going to die in the wilderness. They slammed a rock, got to get some water out for the people. They didn't give the proper attribution to God. Moses and Aaron die in the wilderness too. Not yet. But this is the point in the story where we know that that's going to happen. There's a move into Moab. These are some plains across the Jordan from where the people are eventually going to go. So this gets them sort of into position to cross into. So we're still having narrative moving forward here. We're not going to talk about this. Read the story. So good. Another census is taken. The counting of this second generation happens. So it's this parallel to that first census that happened at the beginning of Numbers. And then we get this lovely little anecdote of the daughters of Zelophehad, who come to Moses. They have no brothers. Their father was of that original generation, so he's going to die. They're going to enter the promised land, and they're not going to inherit because they are girls, right? So they say, hey, we think we should inherit too. Our family, just because we don't have brothers, shouldn't be deprived of getting a portion of what we're to inherit. And so Moses consults the Lord, and the Lord actually says, the daughters of Zelophehad are right? God authorizes these women's interpretation of the law, and they are allowed to inherit. So the law gets revised here in this sort of opening kind of way. Now later they will be required to marry within their tribes, right, to keep it in the family. But there's this beautiful instance of this kind of revision of the law in response to the needs that arise in this way that empowers these women. Skipping right along to Deuteronomy. Hebrew word for Deuteronomy is words, devarim. These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan. In the Greek and the Latin, Deuteronomy is the second law. It's a restatement of the law to this new generation. Hebrew title is just words. It's a really wordy book. Moses is going to make 3 big speeches, a historical review of what's happened, right? Educating this new generation about what's come before, restatement of the law, its rewards and its punishments, and then community responsibility. This is all our responsibility to make a decision together about whether to reject or to obey. What's the so what of Deuteronomy? So generational transmission, major theme. Moses says in chapter 5 at the start of one of his speeches, the Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb. Not with our ancestors did the Lord make a covenant, but with us, who are all of us here alive today. So this is memory, but this is also present, right? The law didn't just apply back then, but now, and the Lord is present with us now too. So there's this real importance of generational transmission, but also really this kind of transposition of this generation is also a law-receiving generation. And there's a big emphasis too on, we also get a sort of humanitarian emphasis in Deuteronomy. And again, it's all relative, right? You got to put a male or female sorcerer to death. But there are some places where this sort of humanitarian emphasis opens up in the law. Here's an example of the Sabbath commandment. The 10 commandments get repeated in Deuteronomy. They actually show up twice. Once in Exodus where everybody knows them, and again for this generation in Deuteronomy. And if you look just at the yellow text, in Exodus, the Sabbath is grounded in God resting at creation. Remember, the creation showed up in the creation of the covenant, right? But in Deuteronomy, it's different. The Sabbath commandment is grounded in remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord brought you up and out. So give rest, not just to your family, but to all the people who work for you. And it's grounded in that history, that salvation history of the Exodus account. So we're seeing, even as the law is restated, the emphasis shifts based on what people have learned and experienced in this wilderness time. We also, I like this one too, coveting a wife shows up as just one of many coveting prohibitions in the Exodus version, right? You shall not covet your neighbor's house, wife, male or female slave, ox, donkey, anything that belongs to your neighbor. The wife is included in the list of things that belong to your neighbor. Deuteronomy, not so. Coveting the neighbor's wife gets a separate line. The wife is no longer part of the enumerated sort of property list. So we see some shifts and changes in the law here. Again, don't go looking for a modern enlightened law code, but we do, when we look at the details, we will see things like that. And then this is probably the most famous passage of Deuteronomy. This is the Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and with all your might. Where else did we see that? Where else have we seen that line in the New Testament? Jesus, right? What story? Which is the most important? The Good Samaritan story, right? This is the other piece of that. When Jesus is pulling together those two, actually it's the lawyer who pulls together those two pieces of the law that Jesus then authorizes, right? This is the other piece. And this is really this is one of the most well-known parts of the Hebrew Bible. And then the command is to keep them, recite them, bind them, fix them, write them. This is something that binds the community together as a people. Theme of blessings and curses, choose life. Choose obedience. Deuteronomy, we're entering into a new school that Matt is going to talk about next time, and beyond of this whole section of the biblical history that presents a new interpretation of why bad things happen. Bad things are a response to bad acts of the people. That is one biblical perspective. The Deuteronomist brings that up. We're going to see that beginning here, but I'm not going to linger on it today because A, we have no more time, and B, we're going to see it again and again repeated. But this is a theme of Deuteronomy. And at the end, we have the death of Moses, right? We come to the end of this wilderness time, and as promised, Moses dies here. The leader doesn't get to go across with the people. That's a new generation, which we'll hear from Matt about next time. And just to end with this little lovely encomium of Moses. Never since has there arisen a prophet in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. He was unequaled for all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt, against Pharaoh and all his servants in the entire land, and for the mighty deeds and terrifying displays of power that Moses displayed in the sight of Israel. Hardly ever in the Bible do you get a line of praise like this. So that it does end with this appreciation for Moses, right as this period of wilderness wandering is coming to an end. And so even in spite of Moses' failings, he is held up as this exemplar of a leader. Okay, I hate this, but I have to be in a robe in Tim's office in about 3 minutes. I am really grateful to be together today, and I hope that if you've got questions, you'll come on Wednesday night to have a chance to talk them through. I recommend the Anna Marsh video. It's wonderful, and let's see what else. Matt will be back next time talking about Joshua and Judges. And if you think I had a hard job, Matt really drew the short straw for next week. So we can come and watch him do his best with that. So thank you all for being here today.